Anyhow, I'm Allison Nelson, and I am here to tell you about my fantastic trip that I took to Cuba in late January, early February with a wonderful organization called Birds Caribbean. And so just to give you a little rundown on me and what I do, I actually run Gold Country Avian Studies, and so we focus on bird conservation and education in the foothills. One of the things that one of our main projects is to run a bird banding station at Empire Mine in the Bennett Street grasslands, and Sierra Foothills Audubon Society has generously supported that program for several years. So many thanks to all of you and all of you board members and continuing board members. And So that's me. That's what I do. I just do a little bit of bird this and a little bit of bird this around the county, and I want to tell you more about Birds Caribbean, this organization that I went to Cuba with. They are a nonprofit, and their focus is on all of the Caribbean islands. Their mission is to raise awareness, promote sound science, and empower local partners to build a region where people appreciate, conserve, and benefit from thriving bird populations and ecosystems. Part of what they do is they run these trips, and I first found out about the organization when I went to a North American Ornithological Conference in 2016, and they had these beautiful prints of Cuban birds for sale to support their efforts. They were by this fabulous artist, Nils Navarro, so ever since I met these Birds Caribbean folks at this table in 2016, I was like, oh, I gotta go to Cuba, I gotta see these birds. I mean, these birds have been hanging framed on my wall for years now, and so I finally got to go in January. But they are a nonprofit, and they run these trips with local guides, and they try to keep the prices pretty reasonable. I think it was a 9-day trip, and including the flight from Miami to Cuba, it was around $3,000, $3,500, something like that, and it includes all of the food and the lodging and the local guides, and I think around $500 of that is tax deductible. So it's nice to go with an organization like that where you're supporting their mission, and it's not just about spending money to see birds. It's really about helping what they do. So some of the other things they work on, they've got a bird festival that they run. They do wetlands and land bird projects, seabird projects. They do a water bird census. They publish the Caribbean Journal of Ornithology. There's a Caribbean birding trail, which they've designated with, you can get a map and find out all about the different sites and the different locations where you can kind of birding hotspots in the Caribbean, so you can help you figure out where you want to go next. They have grants program, they have mentorship program, work a lot with schools. And so they do a lot of training of local people in the communities, getting them familiar with their birds, teaching them how to do surveys, donating binoculars, getting them involved in on-the-ground research, and just really building that enthusiasm for birds and their conservation with the local population. So our trip, we flew into Havana, and this was we met our guide one of our guides in Miami. He met us at the airport. This trip also happened to be with my best friend from high school. We had been wanting to do a trip together for a while, so it was really fun. We kind of came across this. It came into my email box, and she's not even a birder. She just got really excited about it, but I think this trip turned her into a birder because she was just out there with the binoculars and enthusiasm with everybody else. So that was super fun to see that happen for her. So we all met in Miami. And we showed up at the airport super early in the morning. Our guide, who was this fabulous, hilarious British fellow who has been on the board of Birds Caribbean for many years and is a very avid Caribbean birder. He comes back and forth from England to do lots of birding there. We met him at the airport. He gave everybody our visas and an envelope with $1,000 or $2,000 in cash for us to each carry across the border. So they put a lot of trust in their participants. But Cuba is pretty much a cash economy. There's really, we did not exchange money. We did not use ATMs or credit cards while we were there. Everything is really pretty much cash, and everybody will take your dollars. They will not give you change in dollars. They will give you change in Cuban pesos, but they want your dollars. And so if we have time at the end, I'll tell you a funny story about that. Anyhow, so we started in Havana, and they picked us up in a big bus, and we immediately drove out into the Cuban countryside. We didn't stick around Havana at all initially. Headed out into just this lush, green area, which was so amazing, such a different break from California. I mean, California is pretty green in the winter, but not green like Cuba. Since Cuba started opening back up with the Obama administration, I've just been those folks who thought, oh, we've got to go before it changes, and they're driving all those old cars around. We got to see it before things change. And once we got on the bus and we're on the highways, we realized that things are not going to change in Cuba anytime soon. Fortunately or unfortunately, pros and cons to that. But all the cars on the road are these old classic cars. I thought, we'd see one kind of here and there, but literally all the cars on the road are from the 50s or maybe some from the early 60s. Maybe on one hand, I could count the cars that looked newer or more modern. There were some buses that were modern. But this was a pretty typical scene alongside the road. So we headed out in the countryside. One of the first places we stopped was Las Terrazas, which is a lush farming area. Lot of cattle grazing. So I was going to actually comment on that. A lot of the cattle and livestock look like that, and it's not because they don't have enough to eat, because everything looks like this lush greenery, but much of the cattle have worms. So one of the participants on the trip was a dual citizenship Cuban American, and she told us that whenever she goes back and forth to the U.S. and comes back to Cuba, she always brings ivermectin with her to give to the local vets or people she knows so that they can treat their animals. So that's one of the things you have to be concerned about. But so this Las Terrazas was a pig farm, and one of the attractions to this area, lots of tourists stop into this area. One of the attractions was that they put out these feeders, and so Cuban grass quits, yellow-faced grass quits were just kind of all over the area. They put seeds up along the walls and see them. Cuban blackbird was another one that we saw there, smooth-billed Ani. And I'm just going to kind of pepper sort of the itinerary of the trip with the birds that we saw. And we saw so many birds. I'm not going to share, we'd be here all day, but so I'm not going to share every single slide. But so we went from Las Terrazas. That was just kind of a quick stop on the road, and headed out to this area called Pinar del Rio, and headed to the town of Viñales. And so one of the stops along the way there was this former coffee plantation. So we did some birding there. And our first meal was just, they sat us down, and so they just got us right into the spirit of the adventure. Sat us down to a great meal with a live band, which was really fun. This is Andrew. He's most of the photographs of birds in this are Andrew's photographs. He is hilarious. He was kind of like, had kind of a constant, Rudy, you would get along with him great. He had a constant stream of sort of bird-themed bad dad jokes with a British twist. So he was really, he was super fun. He was my favorite person on the whole trip. And then this is Giovanni, who was our bus driver. And he was awesome. He was just so charming and so helpful. And one of the things that they do is the guides. So Andrew's from England, but we had two local guys, Ernesto and Tania, and Giovanni was from Cuba. And the primary guides are teaching their bus drivers how to recognize birds. So we saw him, this was the last time he wore a tie. So the first day, he has to wear the tie when he leaves his bus depot, and then as soon as he gets out of the bus depot, he gets to take off the tie, and he would full on, I wish I had a picture, everybody has these big white rubber boots. He put on the big white rubber boots and the red shirt, and he had this huge hat that he would wear, and he had those binoculars. And it was just so wonderful to see him because he was so excited about it. And he was always cleaning his binocular lenses, and he was very proud of just his participation in this whole event. And they had really instilled this passion in him. And so our guides have certain bus drivers that they really like to work with, and he was one of them. So anyhow, we left the coffee farm, and then we ended up in this town of Vinales. And Vinales is kind of a touristy area. There's lots of fun things to do around there. And we stay in these little places called casas particulares that have, they're basically somebody's home, and they are inviting you into their home. You're renting a couple rooms from them. They're preparing your meals for you. Sometimes there would be 3 or 4 casas particulares together, and then we would all have our meals together in one kind of large common space that was shared by the few houses. But so the woman who ran this place had put together this sign, these lovely handmade signs of all the various cool things you can do around, and then of course all the drinks that you can have them make for you, all of which are rum-based. So you couldn't, wine and beer were harder to find, but rum-based drinks were much easier. So this is what Vinales looks like. This is why it's a very popular touristy region, because it's just gorgeous. It's got these kind of eroded karst hills that are thick with just dense, tangled vegetation and all different kinds of trees and vines, and this is just kind of a typical scene that you would. There's our bus, of course, but so you have these old cars, and then you have people using their horses and coaches, or riding horses, or being pulled by a carriage, and it was challenging to. So many things were charming, but a lot of that, what might be to us charming, is also a result of the real poverty that the area continues to experience. And so also by default, it's a very environmentally, except for the exhaust from the cars, which is just awful, but it's a very environmentally friendly country, because they're using older techniques, they're getting around on foot, they're riding bikes. Gas is very difficult. It's not just expensive, it's very difficult to come by gas. There are very few gas stations. And so you see people who did have scooters riding around on their scooters, and then they'd get into town and they would just coast. They'd turn off their engine and then just coast slowly wherever it is they needed to go, because they didn't want to waste the money on that, they wouldn't want to spend the gas money, or didn't have the gas money. Just a kind of a typical house in the Viñales area, and this is actually a tobacco drying hut. So these are pretty common around. This is kind of what this lush karst-covered hillside looks like. And one of the target species that we went out to see in this area was the Cuban solitaire, which is a thrush. So of course, anybody who knows me knows that I love thrushes, and so it was really fun to see them. And then we also saw out in this area our first Cuban toady, which are just so awesome. Cuban toadies are really cool, and I wish the colors were coming out a little bit better, but they're better on my screen. It's a little washed out here, but this whole area under here is just like a hot pink, and this is just this brilliant, brilliant magenta, and this is this kind of day glow green. And they're supposed to be pretty common, but we didn't see that many of them. And also the trip was pretty focused on target species. Cuba has a lot of endemics, birds that are found in Cuba and nowhere else, or Caribbean endemics, birds that are found in the Caribbean only. So it's pretty focused on that. So it was a little bit of, I'm honestly not much of a kind of lister. So there was a lot of folks like, oh good, we saw that. Everybody get your massive lens the size of my leg and let's all take a picture of this bird. And I tend to like to just hang out and watch them for long periods of time. But anyhow, those were two really cool birds that we saw in Viñales. Also, there was a lot of just kind of stopping and wandering into fields where they had been before and seen some cool birds. You know, of course, you get cattle egrets, which actually aren't very common around here, so it's kind of fun to see cattle egrets. And then, of course, the Cuban trogon. They're a trogon that's only in Cuba. So this field that we went out to, there was a pair of them that was just kind of moving around the edges. So we just spent a lot of time hanging out watching them. Loggerhead kingbird was one that actually showed up not infrequently, pretty cool. Little blue heron. And then interestingly, this is Tanya, one of our other guides. Her husband is not in this picture, but Ernesto, though he's a bird guide, I can't remember his master's or PhD, he studied land snails endemic to Cuba. So Cuba has a lot of really beautiful land snails. So he just, on this same field, he wandered down into this creek bed along the edge of the field and just found all these snails. And if you have never seen a 55-year-old man turn into a 5-year-old boy in an instant, it happened when he picked up these snails. He was so excited about these snails and just was really excited to share about his research with us. So again, this is one of these huts where they dry the tobacco, and they took us to a tobacco farm where they actually roll the cigars. This is what the inside of one of those facilities looks like. And this guy clearly loves his job. He showed us how the drying process works, and showed us how they roll the cigars. And this facility, they still plow the fields with oxen. And this is how they cool off the coffee. They've roasted. They roast it in these big cauldron kind of things, and then they let it kind of cool and dry out on a table like that. So then they have a tasting room like this, and they take recycled water bottles and they sell the coffee beans to you in there. And this was just kind of funny. There was a kid that had this, wild agouti. I can't remember what the Spanish word. It's kind of like a wild rat, really. And this gal, Kristen, had kind of picked it up and was carrying it around, and I was like, oh, I want to hold it, and I'm holding it, and then he's kind of starting to dig his nails into me. I'm like, I'm in Cuba, and there's this wild animal digging his nails into me. Maybe this isn't really the best idea. So so I let him go, gave him back. So this was another just amazing stop that we had along the way. Lots of kind of big group family dinners served family style. This was actually a particularly really good meal. This fish it's not the prettiest fish in the world, but man, was it good. I would have to say, however, I wouldn't go to Cuba for the food. The food is honestly, it's not that good. It's not, part of it is, it's very simple. It's very simple. It's like we tend to think of Cuban food as, empanadas and, things with raisins in them and lots of different spices. And there was just, I think part of it is that it's hard for them to get the spices and it's hard for them to get ingredients. And so we had rice and beans and chicken and fish and some kind of steak or beef of some kind and every meal for 9 days, it was really the same thing. So this was the view from that restaurant, of course, overlooking this valley near Viñales. And so this was the town of Viñales. You get lots of very pro-Che signs all over the place. It's a little town square. It's definitely been restored for the tourist economy, and so the downtown center is nicely remade and redone, and you can get a mojito for $1. So it's a nice little town. And this was actually Kristen and her partner are photographers, and he actually has written books about the birds of Florida. And so they turned their special camera box into a mojito storage box. So they fit all the ingredients in there. One of the very cool things that we did in Viñales was spend an evening on the back deck of Nils Navarro. And he's an amazing illustrator, and he has illustrated, it's on the back table there if anybody wants to look at some of my stuff. He's illustrated, his work been on my wall for a couple years, and it's the Guide to the Endemic Birds of Cuba. And then I think he's coming out with one of all the birds. There is a field guide to the birds of Cuba, but I think he's coming out with his own guide. And so it's just lovely to see these paintings up close, and they're so much more rich and beautiful than you could ever imagine in the books in print. So anyhow, this is just hitting the road again for our next stop. Some more classic scenes along the road. We're heading down the highway. We'd pull over to watch birds and, have to move the fancy optics out of the way so that the oxen could go by. Gas stations sometimes had a pina colada stand attached to them, which was kind of nice. I sort of wish they'd do that here in the U.S. And they were really good pina coladas made with fresh pineapple and fresh coconut and, of course, Cuban rum. And one of the things they asked us to do on this trip was to try to fill our suitcases up with gifts to give people. Taking a trip to the dollar store, things like first aid supplies, aspirin and Tylenol, things that are just really hard to come by in the country because of the embargo and the current political state. There is very little commercial anything in Cuba. Like there are not stores. It's very hard for people to get anything. And so we bought, coloring books and magic markers and things like that. And we just happened to bump into this group of kids at this particular gas station and got some of the stuff out and gave it to them. And they were just so thrilled. Their parents were kind of sitting off on the side, and they all ran over and showed their parents, and they were just super excited about that. Another stop was an orchid garden along the way to of course, check out the amazing orchids, but also a couple of target species. The giant kingbird was one they're pretty rare. So these are, some of these are endemic birds, and they're not just endemic. Many of them are very rare. And so we were pretty thrilled to see the giant kingbird. Had to look around quite a bit for a while. The white-crowned pigeon was another really cool one. This is a female western spindalis. So we're on our way from Viñales, which was over here. We went back to this main highway. The bus gassed up and did some stuff, and we waited on the side of the road for a while. And then we headed down here to this Parque Nacional Ciénaga de Zapata, which is a really big wetland area, and we stayed adjacent to the Bay of Pigs. So I'm going to give you guys a quick history lesson. I had to take my notes, but I thought you might actually, we've all heard of the Bay of Pigs, but probably not everybody kind of knows what that is. Anyhow, in 1952, the American allied Batista led a coup against the existing president, Prio, and Prio was exiled to Miami. And then in 1959, starting on July 26, Castro led the Cuban Revolution against Batista, against this American-supported president. And then in 1960, under Eisenhower, the embargo began, the trade embargo, and the CIA began plotting to overthrow Castro. And it was really Castro who began the alliance with the Soviet Union, and relations with the U.S. really ended under Castro. And so the CIA funded this armed counter-revolutionary brigade, and in 1961, this brigade and an air attack invaded the Bay of Pigs, and it was defeated in 3 days by the Cuban Revolutionary Army, led by Castro. And it's known as this major U.S. policy failure. And it really solidified Cuba's ties to the Soviet Union, and instilled Castro as a hero, and really just ended things with the U.S. But so then when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, unfortunately, they had really been supporting Cuba, but their support of the country really ended, and it started this period where Cuba really didn't have the support of the Soviet Union or the U.S., and so it's just been very, very poor and in a really tough situation due to lack of support and the embargo. So then in 2014, Obama began relaxing those regulations on trade and commerce and telecommunications. But then in 2021, Trump redesignated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. And that was 1 week after the January 6th attacks on the Capitol, that he named them a state of terrorism. Anyhow, so we were right adjacent to the Bay of Pigs in this town called Playa Larga. We stayed in another little casa particulares. This is, just a little cafe overlooking the bay, and kind of the same thing. You go to you think you're going to go to a little cafe in a touristy town and get whatever, and it is just, there's no milk for the coffee. The only snack they have is fried plantains, and then you can get your chicken or your rice and beans or your meat. So it's definitely, you have to dial back your expectations of what it's like to be a tourist. And I've traveled a lot of places. I've been to China, I've been to West Africa, and traveling in Cuba was I'd say one of the more challenging, just because not so much that it's a pain to not have all these things you're looking for, but just because everything's just difficult. It's just hard. And people are so poor that there's a little bit of, and I'm not. I'm not trying to be critical, but you do have to really watch out that people aren't swindling you or taking advantage of Americans and trying to just get more than you expected. That happened to us many times, where we thought we were going to pay one price and then we ended up paying another price. And so it's just, you guys kind of have to be on your toes if you're going to travel there, and just let go of any expectation of how your trip is going to go. So anyhow, there's in most towns there's a lot of political signs like this. This is Castro and Batista and the current president Miguel Diaz-Canel, I think his last name is. And this statue is seen all over the place, and it is not Lenin, it is Jose Marti. Does anybody know who Jose Marti is? Okay, Jose Marti was a poet who was really who really fought to end the Spanish colonization of Cuba, and so he was a martyr. He was very well respected for getting people to try to fight back against the Spanish. And so when Castro took over, Jose Marti was kind of brought back into the forefront of the culture, because they felt like they needed a hero to kind of rally around. And so the words to one of his poems, Simple Verses, I think it's called, are the lyrics to Guantanamera. Well, Guantanamera. So those lyrics are his poetry, and so there's a big effort to people are very proud of their Cuban identity and their Cuban heritage, and there's been, they've just been oppressed and enslaved, and the native people have been taken advantage of endlessly, so there's a very big push for to have people be proud of their country and who they are, and just trying to get everybody else out there, the Soviets and the U.S. and the Spanish, and anyhow, so while we were staying in town, of course, there was just more music all the time, super fun. This is one of the places that we stayed, and this is the proprietress and her mother, and they hired this band to come play for us one night, and this is kind of we would eat in this rooftop deck each evening. And these are some of in the town, there was a garden where they put out feeders. And so these are some of the species that we saw. Tawny-shouldered blackbird. Cuban emeralds were pretty common. We only saw the bee hummingbird. Bee hummingbird is the smallest bird in the world. And they are very, very tiny. And we saw them at this garden. And one thing, and then Cuban pygmy owl, West Indian woodpecker, Cuban oriole. The ones that have Cuban in their name are endemics. They're only found on Cuba. And so one thing that was really fun for me is that there were all these warblers there overwintering that you normally only get to see in the east. And so this is actually a little pop quiz. All right, so these are all warblers that are in the east. Does anybody know what this one is?
Cape May.
Yep, Cape May warbler. And how about this one? And of course, the colors aren't a little washed out, but. All right, that's the northern parula. And then this one's a little bit of a trick. This is a female. Black-throated blue, yep. This little white spot is kind of indicative. Yeah, all right, good. So yeah, so we were constantly seeing warblers. Palm warblers were one of the really most common birds that we saw. And then we arrived January 23rd and left early February. Yeah. This big area is a national park. You can only go into it with a guide, not just your personal guide, but the guide from the park system. So we had our bus full of people and our own guides, and then we picked up their guides and took them into the park with us. And so a lot of our birding was just heading out these long levees and stopping at different places along the way to see what we could see. So of course the flamingos, I'm so sad about these colors. These things are just day-glow, bright orange. So the flamingos were a really, really, really cool, fun thing that we got to see. And this is another trick question. Does anybody know what that bird is?
Great white heron.
All right, maybe this will give you a little different clue. Oh, we don't have them here. It's a reddish egret, white morph, yeah. And so there, if you've ever seen David Attenborough's Life of Birds, where they're these birds are kind of, he reminded me of Big Bird. He kind of walk along like this, and then kind of, run around like this, and he's creating shade. Creating shade so that he can kind of hide himself from the many fish that are in the water. And so this water is super, super shallow, just way far out. And so all these birds are after just this endless amount of fish and life that's out in the wetlands.
Oh, yeah, look at the needlefish.
Oh.
Yeah. These are a couple of other species that we saw. The wood stork, magnificent frigate bird, Cuban blackhawk was another one. This is the male western spindalis. We saw the female earlier. Another day, so Giovanni, the amazing bus driver, he and some of his buddies, we needed to get into this deeper part of the marsh. Again, it's kind of little levees that have been built out there. I guess there used to be peat farms out there, and these levees were built to access the peat. But the road, since the last time they had been there, the road had really closed up and been blocked over, so he went in a day in advance, and they were just out there with chainsaws and just opening the road up so that we could get through with this crazy bus we were going around in. There were a couple of, the Zapata wren was one of our target species. So this bird is not only endemic to Cuba, it's endemic to this particular marsh. So you're only going to find the Zapata wren in this marsh. And then these were some of the other species that we saw while we were there. Cuban blackbird, the Zapata sparrow again. We actually couldn't find this one in the marsh. And then as we were leaving, there was one spot along the road. It's part of the complex, but he was very excited that he had found a new place to find this particular sparrow. Bare-legged owl, super cute dude. And then we lucked out and found this. I'm sorry, it's not the best picture, but we found this little flock of West Indian, baby West Indian whistling ducks, which was very fun. And so Las Hondones is a town adjacent to this area, adjacent to Playa Larga. It's a little town where actually the Ernesto and Tanya have a home. And so they really just warm, welcoming people. They invited us to their home. We drank coconuts that they had pulled out of the trees. They took us to one of their neighbors where we got to drink honey out of the hives of these flightless bees. So they are, this particular species was thought to be endemic to the Yucatan, but they're declining in the Yucatan, and they think that that possibly a hurricane or something like that caused the relocation of some of the bees to the island of Cuba, and so now there's populations there, and apparently they don't sting. But did I say flightless? I meant stingless. That's why I can drink from the hive. Yeah, I don't have to have smoke or nets or anything like that. And the honey was just absurdly flavorful and just so strong and rich. I almost felt kind of woozy after I had a sip from it. And then of course a flock of Cuban parakeets showed up while we were in this little town. Also, one of the neighbors has really, one of the things that they're doing is trying to teach people how to create these bird gardens that can then be tourist attractions to visitors. And so one of the neighbors has done a lot of things to, put feeders out and water features, and the blue-headed quail dove, which is another endemic, was kind enough to show up, and we had to be very quiet. We were warned that they're very, very skittish, and so you have to be super quiet. And sure enough, they put the feet out, and they just kind of wandered in and hung out for a while and moved on. And this probably is my favorite species from the whole trip, the giant lizard cuckoo. He was just such a gorgeous bird, and the light at the time of day that we saw him was just so amazing. And he just threw back his head and made this crazy, crazy sound that you just can't even imagine. And just a big bird. It was really, really fun to see. Lots of different flycatchers. Cuban peewee and Las Agras flycatcher were pretty common. And then the red-legged thrush was another one of my most favorite species, just because they're just so incredible looking with that big kind of red ring around the eye and these bright red legs. And let's see, a couple of other species that we saw along the road: Stygian snail kite, tricolored munia. It was cool to see the snail kite because I really associate them with Florida, so it was fun to see them while we were there. But anyhow, we were on to Havana. We had our last couple of nights of the trip were in Havana, and we had 2 nights with our group, and then my friend Olivia and I stayed on an extra 2 nights just to soak it up a little bit more. And the old center of Cuba has been restored. A lot of the old colonial buildings have been restored. But it's challenging. There's so many during this, they called it the special period, the time after the Soviet Union withdrew, and people were just so desperately poor. They were literally just disassembling these buildings and taking the wrought iron off of them and grinding down the cement to make other things. And the government, there are a lot of kind of state-run museums and tourist attractions, and they've done a lot of work to restore some of the facades. But then you see somebody coming out of a doorway, or you get a peek down a little alley, and the building is just completely crumbling inside. And so, so there's a lot of resentment around the Spanish colonization, and it's you're constantly in this kind of state of being torn, like, oh, the Spanish buildings are so beautiful, but it represents this kind of sad period of Cuba's history. One of the first stops we had in Cuba, or the first stop we had in Cuba, was actually Hemingway's. home. He lived there for a long time and wrote several of his novels there. Again, just some more of the facades, the beautiful castles. There are a number of castles that were put up by the Spanish. What else? Of course, we got to see many of the classic cars as we were driving through town. Che was figured quite prominently throughout. This monument is to, again, Jose Marti. This is the Jose Marti monument. And then one of another stop that we had in Cuba was I'm forgetting his last name, Orlando Garrido, and he is Cuba's. He's really Cuba's most famous ornithologist, and he wrote the Field Guide to the Birds of Cuba. And he's in his 90s. I can't remember exactly how old he is, but he had just had his birthday and was very generous to invite us into his home. And he just told all these great stories. We sat down in his study and he told us all these great stories for an hour. And another interesting thing about our visit there was that we were exposed to the Santeria culture, which is alive and well in Cuba. And you'd see women dressed like this in this all white with kerchiefs or lace gowns. You'd see little girls wearing all white outfits. I brought one of the necklaces, the Santeria necklaces, but they go through a period of purification. It's sort of a ritual of purification where they have to wear white, only white, for a certain length of time and perform certain rituals. And depending on what ritual they're going through, they wear these outfits of just primary colors, like just red and white, or just blue and white, or just yellow and white. There's certain colors are specific to certain efforts or kind of cleansing processes that they're going through. And there was art just everywhere in Cuba. That was my undergraduate degree is actually in fine arts, and it was really fun to be someplace where there is art everywhere. There's galleries and people receiving lessons on how to paint in these little alleyway shops, and really amazing artists. We went to the Museum of Cuban Art, and there's certainly some classical art, but a lot of really amazing modern artists with lots of political statements, mostly a lot of pointy art, and most of the political statements were really against the Spanish rule. There was really almost I don't think there was any art that was making a statement against the communist regime. So there's very much a control over the messaging by the state. And to speak to the people, our guides, who are Cuban nationals, the elections, it's like they just don't even vote, because they go and they vote and there's only one candidate on the ticket, so they don't vote. And they don't even like to talk about it. They're nervous about talking about politics. So there is definitely, it's a communist country. There are certain things you just can and can't do there. Again, just more crazy art. This was all from the Museum of Cuban, and then just street art. Lots of graffiti, amazing artists on the walls. And again, not a lot of commercialism. This was not a Starbucks. This was a Star Cafe Cuba, and with a little bit of a fake Starbucks coffee. And so we saw there were no chain stores, no franchises, except for this Benetton. So we thought it was hilarious that there was a Benetton there because when I was in high school in the late 80s, Benetton was really cool and you never really see Benettons anymore. And there was one in Cuba, in Havana. So we had to have a selfie with the Benetton. And again, sorry, I don't know why my little preview didn't come up, but anyhow, I don't know why there's a big black box, but this is what I was. So again, there's just, the bird songs are quieter than the salsa songs. So again, just music everywhere as you're walking down the street. There are these roving bands that will stop at your restaurant and play music for you. And we did go out salsa dancing one night at a popular club. So it's just so many good dancers. It was really fun. And then we did do the touristy classic car ride, and we were kind of like, oh, because it was organized for us by the organization, and we were sort of trying to decide whether we wanted to do it or not. And I'm so glad we did because it was so fun. You're right around the top down. Our driver was crazy. He was playing this really loud K-pop music, and you're driving along next to your other people with your gang, and so you're waving at each other and whatever, posing and seeing the sights. And that's it. That's my talk. And I just want to say thanks to all the people who took these amazing photographs of birds, and especially Andrew, because most of these are his, and he's a great photographer and great person. And yeah, so thanks. I'm happy to take any questions. No question. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, yeah.
What kind of car were you riding in?
I don't know. I really don't know. A Cadillac, maybe? Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know my classic cars. But so here's my funny story about not getting change in U.S. dollars. Okay, so we thought we had taken enough cash, and then we got there and hadn't taken enough cash, and so we did a little bit of an exchange with one of the guides, because of course we had just brought him thousands of dollars in our envelopes to pay him, and so we were down, we were kind of down to the wire. We had used up our money sort of a second time. We didn't really want to exchange. I think my friend and I had about $50 left, and we knew the taxi ride was going to cost about $25. So we went out to dinner our last night, and we made sure we didn't spend more than $25, and we were okay getting the change in the Cuban pesos because we were leaving anyhow, and we were going to spend on the taxi. So, but I can't remember exactly what the rate is, but so we gave her a $50 bill, and we thought we'd get back these, like a couple of $100 or whatever, $25 in pesos, and they only had small bills. So she brought us out this because the peso doesn't have much value, and so she brought us this stack of money that was like this big, and we had to sit there and make sure we had all the right change, and then when we checked out of the hotel, we had to pay for the taxi in advance, but there was this, there's the exchange rate, and then there's the exchange rate, and so we thought we were getting this one exchange rate, and the gal at the front desk didn't know that the hotel manager had already told us this other exchange rate, and so this is like 6 a.m. in the morning where you only have $25 left, and anyhow, it was just kind of crazy trying to get out the door at the last minute and get to the airport, and but it was really fun. Lots of interesting stories. We learned a lot about traveling while we were there. Yeah. So.
What was your typical day like birding? Did you look early in the morning to bird, or
Yeah.
bird all day long?
Yeah, we'd usually get up pretty early. We'd meet, not always super early, but between maybe 6 and 7 or something. And one day we had to get on the bus by 4 to get out to that place where they had been getting the peat, so we could get the pot of wren. But yeah, we'd do something for the most of the morning, and then we'd have a couple hours of free in the afternoon. And then sometimes there would be a spot that we'd go back out to, and then we'd have dinner as a group. Yeah, but when we were moving from one place to the next, it was kind of just birding all day because we were stopping a lot of places. Sometimes we'd get to sleep on the bus a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Did it seem like there were many areas where the jungle and the forest were intact and hadn't been clear cut? Burned?
Yeah, so a lot, and it's not like, the everything just encroaches on the edges of fields. So, here hedgerows aren't really a big thing, but there they just let things go wild, and you'd see people out on the sides of the highways, like things were just trying to take the highway over, and these crews of guys would be out just with hand tools trying to beat the jungle back alongside the whole length of the highway. There are a lot of invasive species, but a lot of habitat. Yeah.
So you were there in the middle of the winter, but what's the common wisdom about different times of year birding?
I'm not sure. I definitely wanted to go in the winter because that's when you can see our migrant warblers down there. But later in the summer, like, it just gets so hot there. We had a couple of hot days, and man, hot because it's like 100% humidity. I mean, it's really humid there, and so I think he was saying that it starts getting pretty hot in March or April, and then then the bird activity when it's that hot isn't very, very high.
Curious if I could extend my trip.
So that was one thing that was nice.
Because I'll be in January.
Oh yeah, well I would reach out to so this trip when I reached out to my friend, I was like, because there were only 12 people on our trip, and it filled up. I want to say it filled up within a week or so. So you have to kind of jump on it if you want to. Yeah, I don't know when they publish their dates. I think they publish them in the fall for the. I think they kind of run the same trip approximately the same weeks every year. There's a January trip and there's a little bit longer March trip. But you could go to their website, or I could give you the email address of the woman who runs the trip. But that was one thing that was nice. Is so what we did was when we stayed the extra 2 days, I asked if that was going to be a problem. She was like, once you're in Havana, it's not like you're going through any kind of checkpoints or anything. And so we just stayed in the hotel where we had been as a group for 2 additional days, and just they were very helpful. They just arranged, and they paid for it, and we just paid them a little extra so that we could stay in the yeah. Yeah, thank you for having me.